January 17, 1945. Ziegenberg, Germany. The air in the command bunker smelled of damp concrete and burnt tobacco. Outside, snow fell silently over the Taunus hills, blanketing the forests in white, a deceptive peace masking the chaos consuming the Reich. Inside, beneath reinforced ceilings and behind steel doors, Generaloberst Alfred Jodl stood before a map table cluttered with colored pins, each one representing divisions that no longer existed, supply lines that had vanished, tank battalions reduced to memory. His breath formed small clouds in the unheated room. The electric lights flickered. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of artillery, American artillery, rolled like thunder across frozen ground. Jodl's hands, once steady instruments of military precision, now trembled slightly as he moved a red marker across the Western Front. The marker represented nothing. There were no reserves. There was no fuel. There were no factories left untouched by bombing. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in that darkness, he understood something the Führer would never admit. Germany had not been outfought. Germany had been outbuilt. The realization was not sudden. It had accumulated like snow, flake by flake, battle by battle, factory by factory, until the weight became undeniable. The Wehrmacht had entered this war with confidence born of lightning victories, of blitzkrieg campaigns that shattered Poland in weeks, France in months. German generals had studied their craft in the finest military academies, had inherited the Prussian tradition of Bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare, the art of encirclement and annihilation. They had believed, truly believed, that superior tactics, training, and will could overcome any material disadvantage. They had seen their panzers roll across Europe like iron waves, their Luftwaffe darken the skies, their infantry march in disciplined columns that seemed unstoppable. And for a time it had worked. For a time they had seemed invincible. But time is the great revealer of truths, and by January 1945, the truth had become impossible to ignore. Before the storm, there was confidence. In the summer of 1939, as German staff officers finalized plans for Fall Weiss, the invasion of Poland, they operated within a worldview shaped by the previous war. The Great War had taught them that modern conflict was decided by maneuver, by operational art, by the ability to avoid static warfare and achieve decisive battlefield victory. They had seen how Germany, despite being outproduced and blockaded, had nearly won through tactical brilliance. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated them, but it had also crystallized a belief that German military excellence was a kind of force multiplier, capable of offsetting material disadvantages. The Reichswehr, limited to 100,000 men by treaty, had become an elite cadre, every officer a strategist, every soldier a professional. When Hitler began rearmament, these men expanded rapidly, building a Wehrmacht that combined tradition with innovation, combined arms tactics, radio communications, close air support integrated with ground operations. They had created, in their view, the most advanced military machine on Earth. And the early campaigns seemed to confirm this belief. Poland fell in 5 weeks, Denmark in hours, Norway, despite British intervention, in 2 months. Then came France, the great test, the ultimate validation. The French possessed more tanks than Germany, many of them superior models. The French had the Maginot Line, had the British Expeditionary Force, had numerical parity in most categories. But in 6 weeks, France collapsed. The German plan, conceived by Erich von Manstein, sent panzer divisions through the Ardennes forest where they were least expected, bypassing the Maginot Line, encircling Allied armies in Belgium, driving to the English Channel with such speed that Allied commanders lost track of the front lines. It was maneuver warfare perfected. It was Cannae on a continental scale. And when French generals surrendered in the same railway car where Germany had signed the armistice in 1918, it seemed that the circle was complete. German military genius had triumphed over material calculation. The generals toasted their victories. They received promotions, medals, estates. They began planning the invasion of Britain, then turned east toward their ultimate ideological enemy, the Soviet Union. And in those planning sessions, as they calculated logistics for Operation Barbarossa, they made assumptions rooted in their recent experiences. They assumed Soviet industry was primitive, Soviet leadership incompetent, Soviet morale fragile. They assumed the Red Army, gutted by Stalin's purges, would collapse under the same blitzkrieg tactics that had destroyed every other opponent. They calculated that the campaign would last 12 to 16 weeks. Moscow would fall before winter. The Soviet Union would fracture into chaos. What they did not calculate, what their entire conceptual framework prevented them from calculating, was the industrial equation. June 22, 1941, the Niemen River crossing. German soldiers waded through morning mist watching the first waves of bombers streak east toward Soviet airfields. Behind them, 3 million men waited in assembly areas, the largest invasion force in history. Panzer commanders checked their fuel gauges, noted they had enough for perhaps 300 kilometers of offensive operations, expected to refuel from captured Soviet stocks. Infantry officers distributed ammunition, enough for several weeks of combat, expected to resupply from depots that would follow the advance. The soldiers carried chocolate, cigarettes, bread, rations calculated for a summer campaign. They expected to be home by Christmas. They expected another lightning victory. They advanced into a country whose industrial capacity they fundamentally misunderstood. The Soviet Union in 1941 possessed something the Germans had not encountered before: strategic depth married to industrial scale. When Napoleon had invaded Russia, he had found an agricultural empire with some manufacturing in Moscow and St. Petersburg. When the Wehrmacht invaded, they found a country that had undergone forced industrialization on a scale unprecedented in human history. Stalin's 5-year plans, brutal and costly in human terms, had created entire industrial cities beyond the Urals: Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, steel mills and tank factories that German intelligence had noted but not comprehended. These factories were not artisan workshops producing quality over quantity. They were mass production facilities built on American models, designed to produce thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, millions of shells. German planners had looked at Soviet industrial statistics and dismissed them as propaganda. They had seen the crude design of Soviet equipment and assumed inferiority. They had not understood that crude design meant simplicity, meant maintainability, meant that a T-34 tank could be produced in a fraction of the time required for a German Panther, could be repaired by barely trained mechanics, could be crewed by peasants given weeks of instruction. The Wehrmacht drove deep into Soviet territory, winning tactical victories, encircling entire armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. And yet the Red Army did not collapse. For every Soviet unit destroyed, another appeared. For every T-34 knocked out, 2 more emerged from the factories. German soldiers began to whisper about Russian space, the endless distances, the roads that dissolved into mud, the forests that seemed to swallow their supply columns. But space was not the primary problem. The primary problem was that behind those endless spaces, the Soviet Union was producing war material at rates the Germans could not match. By the time the Wehrmacht reached the outskirts of Moscow in December 1941, German tank divisions that had begun the campaign with over 200 panzers each were down to 30 or 40 operational vehicles. Not primarily from combat losses, though those were heavy, but from mechanical breakdowns, lack of spare parts, absence of adequate maintenance facilities. The German supply system, designed for short campaigns in Western Europe, was stretched across 1,000 kilometers of primitive roads and single-track railways. Meanwhile, Soviet factories, some of them evacuated and reassembled beyond the Urals even as fighting raged, were producing tanks at peacetime German production rates. Not wartime, peacetime, every single month. And then the United States entered the war. December 11, 1941. Berlin. Hitler declared war on America 4 days after Pearl Harbor, a decision that baffled some of his generals even then. The Japanese attack had not required German support. The Tripartite Pact was defensive. But Hitler, contemptuous of American military capability, believing American society too decadent and divided to wage sustained war, declared war anyway. It was an ideological decision, a racial decision, rooted in his conviction that mongrel democracies could not match the will and discipline of fascist states. German military planners focused on the Eastern Front paid little attention. America was far away, across an ocean. America had a small army. America's industrial capacity, though large, was geared toward consumer goods, automobiles, refrigerators, radios, not weapons of war. This assessment was correct in December 1941. It would be catastrophically wrong by 1943. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that American industrial capacity was not merely large. It was fundamentally different in kind. The United States had pioneered mass production, had invented the assembly line, had created a culture of standardization and interchangeability that extended from automobile factories to shipyards to aircraft plants. Henry Ford's factories had demonstrated that complex machines could be produced not by skilled craftsmen working slowly, but by semi-skilled workers following systematic processes at extraordinary speed. The American economy in peacetime had already achieved production volumes that European nations could barely imagine. And when that economy pivoted to war production, the results were not linear. They were exponential. In 1941, the United States produced fewer than 4,000 military aircraft. In 1944, American factories produced nearly 100,000. In 1941, American shipyards delivered ocean-going cargo vessels at a rate of a few dozen per year. By 1943, they were launching Liberty ships, 10,000-ton cargo carriers, faster than one per day. In 1941, the U.S. Army had approximately 400,000 men and a handful of modern tanks. By 1944, it had over 8 million men under arms and was producing tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, and ammunition at rates that exceeded the combined output of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The numbers were so absurd, so disproportionate, that German planners who saw them assumed they were Allied propaganda. They were not propaganda. They were the arithmetic of industrial democracy turned to total war. March 1943. Tunisia. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, evacuated from North Africa before the final collapse, wrote in his diary about the impossibility of his situation. The Afrika Korps had fought brilliantly for 2 years, winning battles against numerically superior British forces through tactical innovation and aggressive maneuver. Rommel himself had become a legend, the Desert Fox, master of armored warfare in open terrain. But in the end, tactics had not mattered. What mattered was that the British received supplies through Alexandria and Cairo, pipelines of fuel and ammunition that never stopped, while Axis supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean were hunted by British aircraft and submarines. What mattered was that British tanks, though inferior in initial design, were replaced faster than they were destroyed, while every lost German tank was irreplaceable. What mattered was that by late 1942, the British had received hundreds of American Sherman tanks, and behind those Shermans stood American factories capable of producing thousands more. Rommel had requested reinforcements, had pleaded for adequate fuel and ammunition, had outlined what would be needed to hold North Africa. The replies from Berlin were filled with promises and explanations. Resources were needed on the Eastern Front, fuel production was constrained, transportation was limited. What the replies did not say, what was becoming increasingly clear to officers in the field, was that Germany was engaged in a war of attrition it could not win. German production in 1943 amounted to approximately 19,000 military aircraft. Anglo-American production that same year exceeded 150,000. German tank production peaked at around 6,000 vehicles per year. Soviet production alone exceeded 30,000 annually, and American production added another 20,000. The arithmetic was merciless. And yet the Wehrmacht kept fighting, kept innovating, kept achieving tactical victories that would have ended wars in earlier eras. German tanks, when they appeared, were often superior, Tigers and Panthers with thick armor and powerful guns that could destroy Allied tanks at ranges beyond effective retaliation. German aircraft, when they could get airborne, included jets, the Me-262, a revolutionary design capable of speeds that Allied fighters could not match. German soldiers remained disciplined, well-trained, often fanatical in their resistance. But none of it was enough because for every Tiger tank Germany produced, America produced dozens of Shermans. For every German jet, hundreds of Allied conventional fighters filled the skies. For every German soldier, 10 Allied soldiers eventually landed in Europe, equipped with so much ammunition that American infantry tactics involved suppressive fire on a scale German troops found incomprehensible. American squads would expend more ammunition in a single engagement than German squads were allocated for an entire day. German commanders began to encounter something they had not experienced in the early war years, the sensation of tactical irrelevance. June 6, 1944, Normandy. When the Allied invasion fleet appeared off the French coast, German defenders stared at a horizon filled with ships. Not dozens of ships, thousands. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers providing gunfire support, transport vessels disgorging tanks, trucks, artillery. Behind them, control of the skies so absolute that German fighters barely appeared. German officers watching from fortified positions realized they were witnessing industrial capacity made manifest. Every shell fired by naval guns represented American or British manufacturing. Every aircraft overhead represented an intact factory system. Every tank rolling off landing craft represented a production line operating 3 shifts. The German defenders fought hard, inflicted casualties, held some positions for hours or days. But they were fighting against an enemy for whom losses were temporary inconveniences, because behind the front line stood a replacement system capable of regenerating entire divisions. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, requested permission to withdraw to more defensible positions, to trade space for time, to conduct the kind of mobile defense that had worked in earlier campaigns. Hitler refused. Every kilometer of ground must be held. Every position must be defended to the last. Von Rundstedt, a Prussian aristocrat who had commanded armies since before the Führer came to power, understood the futility. Germany no longer had the fuel for mobile operations. Germany no longer had the reserves to conduct strategic withdrawals and counterattacks. Germany had only static defenses and dwindling resources, facing an enemy that could afford to batter those defenses with artillery barrages that lasted hours, that could replace every destroyed unit, that could sustain offensive operations indefinitely. The commanders began to understand what the soldiers had already learned. They were fighting not just armies, but economies. The object that haunted their memory was American rations. In the chaos of the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, German soldiers overran American supply depots in the first days of the attack. What they found there shocked them more than any tactical surprise. Warehouses filled with food, canned meat, chocolate bars, cigarettes, coffee. Not survival rations, but abundance. American soldiers ate better in field conditions than German civilians ate at home. The discovery was demoralizing in a way combat was not, because it revealed the nature of the industrial disparity. An army that could afford to ship chocolate bars across an ocean, that could supply every soldier with cigarettes and coffee, that could waste resources on individual luxuries, was an army backed by such overwhelming productive capacity that resistance became metaphysically futile. German soldiers, hungry and exhausted, ate captured American rations and understood. They had been told they were fighting decadent weaklings. They had been told that National Socialist discipline and Aryan will would triumph over soft democracies. But the evidence suggested otherwise. The evidence suggested that democracies, precisely because they were democratic, had mobilized their populations and industries more effectively than any totalitarian state. American factories were not staffed by slave laborers or conquered populations. They were staffed by citizens who received wages, who had reasons to increase productivity, who participated in a system that rewarded efficiency. American soldiers were not fighting for abstract racial destiny. They were fighting to end the war and go home, which meant they wanted the war prosecuted efficiently, wanted overwhelming force applied, wanted industrial solutions to military problems. The chocolate bars were symbols. They represented a civilization that had so thoroughly mastered production that it could afford inefficiency, could afford waste, could afford to treat its soldiers as human beings entitled to comfort rather than as instruments of ideological will. By 1945, the testimony was written in ruins. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW, sat in command meetings where Hitler demanded offensives that had no supplies, counterattacks with divisions that existed only on paper, victories to be achieved through will alone. Keitel, once a competent staff officer, had become a yes man, but even he understood the reality. German factories, those that still existed, were being bombed around the clock. By day, American B-17s flew in formations of hundreds, escorted by long-range fighters, dropping tons of high explosives on industrial targets. By night, British bombers incinerated cities. The campaign was not precision. It was obliteration. Ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, rail yards, all targeted systematically. German production did not stop, but it fragmented, dispersed into underground facilities and improvised workshops where efficiency collapsed. Meanwhile, Allied production accelerated. The United States in 1944 produced more war materiel than Germany, Japan, Italy, and the Soviet Union combined. A statement so absurd that it required recalculation to believe, but the statistics were verified by multiple sources. American factories operated with such excess capacity that they supplied not only American forces, but British, French, Soviet, Chinese, and numerous smaller Allied nations. Lend-lease shipments to the Soviet Union alone included nearly 15,000 aircraft, over 12,000 tanks, 400,000 trucks, more vehicles than the Red Army had possessed at the start of the war. The trucks were particularly significant. They allowed Soviet forces to conduct mobile operations on a scale that would have been impossible with horse-drawn transport, transformed the Red Army from a largely foot-bound force into a mechanized juggernaut. German generals saw the trucks. They saw the aircraft. They saw the endless columns of American vehicles rolling through liberated France. Every truck standardized, every part interchangeable, every unit supplied with fuel and ammunition in quantities that seemed wasteful. They understood, finally, that they had been fighting not tactical battles, but an industrial equation they could never balance. April 1945. Interrogation rooms. As the Reich collapsed, Allied intelligence officers began interviewing captured German commanders. The interviews were meticulous. designed to extract operational intelligence and assess strategic thinking. What emerged from these sessions was a pattern of testimony, a recurring theme that appeared in the statements of generals from different branches and backgrounds. Jodl said it, Keitel said it, Rundstedt said it, even Goering, once boastful, admitted it. The statements varied in wording, but converged on a single conclusion. Germany had not been defeated by superior tactics. Germany had not been defeated by superior soldiers. Germany had been defeated by industrial capacity. Generaloberst Franz Halder, former chief of the General Staff, stated it plainly in his interrogation. We did not anticipate the scale of American production. We knew the figures, but we did not believe them. We assumed they were propaganda. When we finally accepted them as real, we realized the war was unwinnable. Jodl, interrogated at Nuremberg, testified, the decisive factor was the enemy's overwhelming material superiority, their capacity to replace losses, to sustain operations, to concentrate resources at will. This we could not match. Our tactical victories became irrelevant. These were not excuses. They were autopsies. The generals were not claiming they had done everything right and been overwhelmed by circumstance. Many acknowledged mistakes, poor decisions, strategic failures. But beneath the tactical discussions, beneath the arguments about operational art and campaign planning, lay a recognition that the fundamental problem had been industrial. Germany had entered a war believing that military excellence could overcome material disadvantage, and that belief had been systematically disproven. The irony was bitter. Hitler had come to power promising to restore German greatness through will and racial destiny. He had rebuilt the Wehrmacht into a formidable force, had achieved stunning early victories, had conquered most of Europe. But he had done so while ignoring the basic arithmetic of industrial warfare. He had diverted resources to ideological projects, concentration camps, racial policies, prestige weapons, rather than maximizing production. He had structured the economy around competing bureaucracies and personal empires rather than rational planning. He had started wars with countries whose combined industrial capacity exceeded Germany's by orders of magnitude, and he had done so believing that spirit would triumph over steel. It had not. The symbolic object was a simple thing: a tin can. In the post-war interrogations, multiple German officers mentioned it. The Americans and their tin cans, canned food for every meal, canned fuel in jerry cans, canned ammunition in standardized boxes. Everything canned, boxed, packaged, standardized. To European eyes, even Allied European eyes, American logistics looked wasteful. Too much packaging, too much redundancy, too much emphasis on convenience. But to German commanders who had watched their supply systems collapse, who had seen horses die for lack of fodder and tanks halt for lack of fuel, the American tin cans represented something profound. The victory of systematic organization over improvisation, of planned abundance over desperate scarcity. German logistics had been artisanal. Each division had different requirements, different equipment, different supply needs. German trucks were manufactured by multiple companies with non-interchangeable parts. German ammunition came in numerous calibers. German supply officers were problem solvers, constantly improvising solutions to shortages. It had worked adequately in short campaigns where looted supplies could fill gaps. It had failed completely in prolonged conflicts where systematic replacement was necessary. American logistics were industrial. Standardization meant that a single replacement part fit thousands of vehicles. Containerization meant that supplies could be loaded in America, shipped across oceans, and delivered to frontline units without repacking. Redundancy meant that losses were expected and planned for, not treated as crises. The tin can, humble, mass-produced, disposable, was the perfect symbol of this approach. It was not elegant, not impressive, not sophisticated. It was simply effective at scale, and scale was what mattered. The transformation was philosophical. In the years after the war, as German officers wrote memoirs and military historians analyzed the conflict, a consensus emerged. The Wehrmacht had been an excellent tactical force that lost a strategic war. German operational art, the level of warfare between tactics and strategy, involving armies and campaigns, had often been superior. German soldiers had frequently been better trained. German equipment, when it worked, had sometimes been more advanced. But none of these advantages had mattered against an enemy that could afford to lose battles and still win the war, that could trade space for time and casualties for production, that could simply outlast and outbuild any opposition. The realization changed military thinking. The post-war Bundeswehr, when West Germany was rearmed, emphasized integration with NATO and acceptance that modern warfare required industrial alliances. The Soviet Union, having witnessed American productive capacity through Lend-Lease, structured its Cold War military around mass production and standardization, accepting that crude but numerous weapons were superior to sophisticated but scarce ones. Military theorists globally began emphasizing logistics, industrial planning, and economic capacity as primary factors in strategic calculation. The generals, who had testified about industrial defeat, were not excusing their participation in Hitler's wars. Many of them had committed crimes, had enabled atrocities, had served an evil regime. Their testimony about industrial capacity was not moral exoneration, but it was historically significant because it marked a moment when a military caste steeped in traditions of tactical excellence admitted that those traditions were insufficient. The Prussian inheritance, the general staff system, the Bewegungskrieg doctrine, all had failed not because they were executed poorly, but because they were conceptually inadequate for industrial total war. Democracy had defeated fascism not primarily through better ideology, though that mattered, but through better production. Freedom had triumphed not because it made better soldiers, though it did, but because it made more tanks, ships, aircraft, trucks, shells, bombs, and, yes, tin cans. The American advantage was not battlefield genius. It was the ability to mobilize an entire continental economy, to convert automobile factories into tank factories, to train millions of workers, to organize supply chains spanning oceans, to sustain combat operations for years without exhausting resources. Autumn 1946. Nuremberg. The trials were winding down. Generals sat in the dock, listening to prosecutors catalog crimes and present evidence. Many would hang. Others would serve prison sentences. Some would be released, deemed instruments rather than architects of the regime. Jodl sat impassive, knowing his fate. When asked about military strategy, about decisions made and battles lost, he spoke in the clipped language of staff officers, precise, factual, emotionless. But on one topic, his testimony acquired a different quality: industrial capacity. He spoke as if explaining a mathematical proof, something objective and undeniable. Germany had produced approximately 50 million tons of steel in 1944. The United States alone had produced over 90 million. Germany had manufactured 2 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during the entire war. America had manufactured 47 billion. Germany had built 34,000 tanks and self-propelled guns from 1939 to 1945. America had built nearly 90,000, and the Soviet Union over 100,000. The judges listened. The prosecutors took notes. The reporters wrote their stories. And history recorded that the Wehrmacht's generals, even in defeat, even facing execution or imprisonment, acknowledged this singular truth. They had been defeated not by better warriors, but by better factories. The epilogue is written in every war since, When military planners design forces, they calculate not just battle performance but production capacity. When nations consider conflict, they assess not just army size but industrial base. The lesson of 1945 became foundational. Modern war is decided by economics as much as arms. Hitler had started World War II believing in will, destiny, and racial superiority. He ended it in a bunker beneath Berlin, blaming everyone except his own strategic blindness. The generals had believed in tactical excellence and operational art. They ended in prison cells, testifying that tactics meant nothing against assembly lines. The American tin can, mass-produced and mundane, had defeated the German Tiger tank, sophisticated and lethal, by the simple expedient of existing in vastly greater numbers. The Liberty ship, crude and hastily built, had defeated the U-boat, precisely engineered and deadly, by being produced faster than it could be sunk. The democracy that Hitler dismissed as weak and decadent had mobilized its citizens, organized its industries, and produced weapons at scales that totalitarian regimes, for all their propaganda about efficiency and will, could never match. This was the testimony. This was the truth they admitted when all else was stripped away. That industrial capacity, not tactics, had defeated them under Hitler. That abundance, not valor, had won the war. That in the contest between fascist will and democratic production, production had proven decisive. The snow still fell on German forests. The bunkers remained, empty now, monuments to failed ideologies. And in the archives and thousands of pages of interrogation transcripts and trial testimony, the general's words remained as historical record. They had fought brilliantly and lost completely because they had brought tactical thinking to an industrial war. In the end, they had been outbuilt, and in being outbuilt, they had been undone.